hour, and I'm going to start with the question of what Sufism is. Then from that I'm going to move on to the question of how is it that Sufism came to be identified as traditional and as moderate. And then when we've looked at that and unpacked those two concepts a bit, I'm going to move on to a review of some of the leading traditional and moderate Sufi organizations operating in the world at present, and that will then bring me to the conclusion where I'll ask, well, are they really traditional and are they really modern? And then we have the question and answer. So to start off with the question of what is Sufism. Now I'm hoping that all of you know the answer to that because you've had the chance to read this introduction to Sufism by Waynes here. And assuming that you have mostly read that? Yes, good, okay. Well, this being a historical introduction, it really ends in the 14th century. The fact that this takes you from the beginning of Sufism up to the 14th century, I think answers the question that in one sense, Sufism clearly is traditional, right? If it's been around since before the 14th century, then yeah, presumably that means traditional. What I'm going to add to what you've already read is to bring you up to date slightly on what has happened since the 14th century. And as Professor Waynes left it in this chapter at the end of the 14th century, he left you with two forms of organization of Sufism, one of them being the Khanaqah and the other one being the Tariqah. And if you remember, the Khanaqah was a sort of full-time house full of Sufis, just being Sufis and not really doing anything else, focusing on ascetic exercises and things like that, whereas the Tariqah was a part-time, rather more diffuse way of organizing things, which is generally called in English the Sufi order. And the essential distinction is the full-time in the Khanaqah and part-time in the Tariqah. The people who belong to a Tariqah have jobs, have families, live out in the world, and come together, once or twice a week to do Sufi exercises together, but also, do some ascetic practice at home during the week and so forth. So that was the situation in the 14th century. What has happened since the 14th century is that the Khanaqah form really withered away mostly, and the Tariqah form became very, very, very widespread. So that by about 1850, you would find Sufi Tariqahs everywhere across the Muslim world, and you would find them, the leaders of some of these Tariqahs, integrated into the religious establishment. So if you went to one of the great seats of learning, like the Azhar in Cairo, for example, you would find that not all the people teaching there belonged to a tariqah, but many of them did. So you've got an overlap between the regular ulama religious establishment and the Sufi religious establishment. That's quite important to remember because many people like to put them in opposition to each other, which at one point was quite fashionable, but just really isn't true, I'm afraid. So, here we are in about 1850, and Sufism in the Tariqah form has become extremely widespread and has become an important part of the religious establishment. That, in some ways, is the peak of Sufism, because after this, things start to go wrong. And they go wrong in the 19th century when Sufism comes up against four major problems. The first one up here, no, doesn't work for this either. Yes, it does. First one up here is the Wahhabis. I assume you're all familiar with the Wahhabis, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the Najd, and his reformist movement, which people describe in various ways. One of the things you can call it is Puritan in certain ways. It was very Puritan, and another way you can describe it is very exclusivist, because as far as they were concerned, they were the true Muslims who got everything right, and everybody else who got everything wrong. And there were two groups that had got things especially wrong. One was the Shia, and the other was the Sufis. So this is the beginning of one of the big problems that Sufis are going to have until this day, starting in fact at the end of the 18th century with the Wahhabi movement. So we've got this very powerful revivalist movement, reformist movement, Puritan movement, whatever you like, which is very much criticizing everything to do with Sufism and saying that Sufism is shirk, that Sufis are not Muslims at all. That's what's happening coming in towards the Sufis from the peripheries of the Muslim world, from the Arabian Peninsula and so on. The other problem that they have is centralizing states, because the 19th century is the period in which the Egyptians, the Ottomans, everybody is trying to build nice modern states like the European states, centralized states. And one of the things that you do if you're centralizing a state is you try to take control of everything that's going on within that state. And this includes taking control of Sufism on an organizational level, but perhaps even more importantly, the Sufis have acquired over the centuries a lot of wealth, a lot of property, buildings, mosques, and so forth. And all this waqf property, if you're familiar with the term in Sharia, all this endowed property is confiscated by these modern states, which are taking away the material power base of the Sufis. Now, of course, Sufism is not just about having assets and so forth. Sufism is primarily about ascetic practice and prayer and things like this. But for any organization, whether it's a Sufi tariqa or a university, funding is pretty important. And if you lose your funding, you're in a mess. So that's the second problem that they're having. Third problem is mass education, because the 19th century is the beginnings of the modern schooling system across the Muslim world. It's the beginning of a system where everybody is going to learn chemistry and geology and all sorts of things like that, like what everybody learns in school nowadays. And this changes the way that people think about the world. And a lot of Sufism has been about stories of the great sheikhs of the past, and a lot of the stories of the great sheikhs of the past have been about the miracles that they have wrought. So towards 1900, miracles are becoming rather less believable than they were in, say, 1750. So the change of mentalities, the rationalism that comes with mass education, is the third problem that the Sufis are having. The fourth problem they're having is the modernists. This is the reformist Muslims, the rationalist reformist Muslims, people like Sayyid Ahmed Khan in India, people like Muhammad Abdu in Egypt. There's at least somebody you can name in every Muslim country who is trying to modernize Islam and make it rational and fit with science and suitable for the modern world and so forth. And for these modernists, Sufism is an embarrassment. There's nothing rational about it. It's superstitious, it's old-fashioned, it's backward, it's in no way progressive, it contributes nothing to social welfare, etc., etc., etc. So, towards the end of the 19th century, Sufism really seems to be on the way out. The one exception is that on the edges of the Muslim world, the major anti-colonial revolts are very often led by Sufis. The most famous of whom is the Emir Abdul Qadir, who we see here, who leads a revolt in Algeria against the French occupation and becomes extremely famous as a result of this. In the end, he loses his campaign against the French and winds up living in Damascus, where he runs a small school for the study of Ibn Arabi, who is one of the greatest of the Sufi mystic theologian philosophers. So this guy is warrior and Sufi and scholar all in one. And also he has the Légion d'honneur, and he's quite famous in France as well. The last of all of these great Sufi leaders in the very end of the pre-modern period in some places, beginning of modernity in other places, is this guy, Ahmed al-Sharif al-Sunusi, who is leading a revolt in Libya against the Italians. And he's in some ways the last survival of a very old phenomenon, Sufi military leaders. And he also gets involved in something quite modern, which is the First World War. Because he's fighting the Italians. Who's on the opposite side to the Italians? The Germans. Who is therefore going to help him? The Germans. How are they going to get munitions to him? Well, what about using a submarine? So we have a Sufi being supplied by German submarines, and the Germans are actually more interested in fighting the British than fighting the Italians, so they encourage him to take his forces into Egypt against the British army, which is the end of them militarily. The British army turns out to be more difficult than the Italian army. So that's to bring you up to date on what's been happening with Sufism, and we're sort of leaving you in 1916 here with the defeat of the Senussis. Were the Senussis moderate? I think not. Depends who you ask, doesn't it? I mean, if you ask the Germans or the Ottomans, who are fighting on one side in the First World War, who are on the same side of these guys, I don't know whether they'd say they were moderate, but they would certainly say that they were fighting on the right side. If you ask the British or the French, who were being fought by them, they certainly did not see them as moderate, they saw them as fanatical. So, that was that. Here's my next question, how is it that Sufism suddenly became seen as traditional? Well, fine, we've got that. How did it come to be seen as moderate? The first explanation of this is what happened to two of the enemies of the Sufis going back to the 19th century, to the Wahhabis and the modernists. So the first thing that happens is that the Islamic modernism changes during the 1920s, 1930s, and the modernists turn into the Muslim Brothers. And Wahhabism changes a bit as well, a bit later, and the Wahhabis turn into the Salafis. Now, whatever we mean by moderate, it certainly isn't the Salafis and the Muslim Brothers. So as a result of this, suddenly traditional Islam in the form of Sufism has at least the potential to be seen by many people very favourably, because it fulfills the old rule that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So if I'm having problems with the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis, as many people are, the guys who are the enemies of the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis must be my friends. So that's the first thing that changes the status of Muslims. We then have a number of Arab leaders who decide to adopt and support particular Sufis. And the earliest one of these really is Hafez al-Assad, who establishes a good relationship with Ahmed Kuftaro. Ahmed Kuftaro, who is now dead, was a prominent Naqshbandi sheikh in Damascus, and he established a very good cooperative relationship with the Ba'ath regime, whereby he said nice things about the Ba'ath regime, and he specifically said very nice things about Hafez al-Assad, like Hafez al-Assad is a good Muslim. Yeah? In return, he got lots of funding from the Syrian government, and perhaps even more important, he got all the necessary security clearances to invite whoever he wanted, have however many large crowds as he wanted, to listen to however many long sermons and lessons and so forth as he wanted, which nobody else could get. So the form that the Syrian support for him takes is, yes, partly it's positive support, and partly it's the absence of restrictions. And in an authoritarian state like Ba'athist Syria, absence of restrictions can be really, really important. So what does the Syrian regime get out of this? It gets his support when they are putting down a Muslim Brotherhood uprising in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So that's very nice, and that's the Syrian example. We have another Ba'athist example, as it happens, and that is in Iraq. Now, what we all learned from our first encounter with the Ba'ath Party in our textbooks is that the Ba'ath Party is secularist, right? And we also learn that the Ba'ath Party was determined to get around tribal divisions and religious divisions and establish a modern nation state. And that's sort of true until everything went wrong for the Iraqi Ba'ath Party after the invasion of Kuwait. And income sanctions, and the Iraqi regime has to shift into survival mode. And part of survival mode is to drop all these plans and start using tribal structures to get support. And also to start using Sufis to get support. And we have something called the faith campaigns. And one of the leaders of the faith campaigns was the Iraqi vice president, who we see here looking very much like a Syrian, like an Iraqi Ba'athist, not particularly like a Sufi. He looks slightly more like a Sufi in this one. I think he's really dressed up as a tribal sheikh or something. But anyhow, we get the support of two tariqas, the Naqshbandiyya and the Ghaznaniyya in Iraq. Okay, that's what's happening before the event that changed the world. And here's the event that changed the world. And after the event that changed the world, the West is searching for moderate Islam, because we cannot have a battle, a crusade against Islam. That doesn't work at all. We have to have a war on terror, or perhaps a war on extremism, and we have to find some moderate Muslims to be on our side during the war on terror and the war on extremism. And here we get Sufis popping up. And here is one of the more famous and more controversial American Sufis. He's actually of Lebanese origin, Hisham Kabeni, having a photo op. So here we have to ask about how is it that people in the West have been seeing Sufism. And this story of how people in the West have been seeing Sufism goes back an awful long way. The chapter you read on Sufism starts with a discussion of Ibn Tufail's Hai Ibn Yaqzan, the Sufi Robinson Crusoe, I think they called it.
Yeah.
Well, that isn't coincidence, because this is one of the most famous Sufi texts in the West. Here, 1671, a translation of the Hai Ibn Yaqzan into Latin. And this Latin translation was then translated into English, Dutch, German, French, etc., and read all over Europe, and became one of the best known Islamic texts in the West for an awful long time. And it's still pretty well known, and you can still find translations of it in an awful lot of non-specialist bookshops. It was known as the Philosophos Autodidactus, the self-taught philosopher, was the title of the Latin translation. And this, don't really have time to go into too much detail, but this translation was read with great interest by the sort of European philosophers who were later going to produce the Enlightenment, who decided that Sufism was a sort of philosophy and was an especially enlightened sort of deistic philosophy. So right from 71, give it 20 years for everybody to read this book, by 1700 there is a wide understanding in Europe that Sufism is an extremely liberal and moderate philosophy. This understanding is cemented in this Chambers Encyclopedia entry here in 1743, which manages to link Sufism with Spinoza. And can't get more moderate than Spinoza, can we? So Sufism and Spinoza get linked together in this point, and from this point onwards, in the back, it's not the sort of first thing you learn at school in Europe, but in the back of the European mind, there is this idea of Sufism being extremely religiously liberal and philosophical and Spinozist and pantheist and I don't know what else. This is an understanding which is built on by a crucial publication which comes out in 2003, and it is published by the RAND, which is a major American think tank, quite close to the government, and it was written by somebody called Cheryl Bernard, who you probably have not heard of. She isn't well known as an expert on Sufism. She's actually previously well known as an expert on feminism. However, you may or may not have heard of her husband, who has been the US envoy to Afghanistan right from the beginning of the American invasion of Afghanistan to the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. So he is super important in US foreign policy. Anyhow, what do we learn from this book? We learn that Sufism represents an open intellectual interpretation of Islam. And we also learn that Sufism is a mystical form of Islam that preaches tolerance and a search for understanding. So, says Rand, says Cheryl Bernard, says actually several hundred years of European misunderstanding of Sufism, this is the moderate democratic Islam that we must support. I'm not suggesting it's just because of this report that a lot of Western states decide to support Sufism as a moderate form of Islam. There are other things going on as well, but this particular report is puts the whole logic of the thing, the whole understanding of the thing, very concisely. That's what's going on in the West. Something very similar is happening in the Muslim world, when after the Casablanca bombings of 2003, you may or may not, probably you don't any longer actually remember the Casablanca bombings of 2003. So we have 9/11 and everybody thinks this is, about America, and then we have, then we suddenly start having bombings elsewhere in the world, which makes clear to everybody that this is not just about America. And one of the places where we have some bombings is in Casablanca, and this is a total shock to the Moroccans, who thought that this fight between the Americans and various sorts of Islamists had absolutely nothing to do with that. And then after the 2003 Casablanca bombings, it becomes clear that it is pretty relevant to Morocco as well. And this is the background to a speech made in 2004 by King Mohammed VI, who declares in this speech a new religious policy. This is going to be the Moroccan response to the challenge of everything, the challenge that was made clear by these 2003 bombings. And his response is to establish traditional Moroccan Islam. So these Salafism people, they're not Moroccan, they're not traditional, this is a foreign interpretation of Islam. He doesn't say it's Saudi, but that's what he means, and everybody understands this. This is a foreign, alien interpretation of Islam, not us at all. What is our Islam here in Morocco? It is made up of four things. It is made up of the Ash'ari Aqidah. What is the Ash'ari Aqidah? Doesn't really matter. The main point is that the Salafis don't like it. What else is it? It's the Ash'ari Aqidah, and it is the Madhahib. What's a madhab? It's a school of law. Main point is the Muslim Brothers don't like it, the modernists don't like it. Okay, so we've got two things here which are characterizing his understanding of traditional Islam, Moroccan Islam. The third thing is the Sufi tariqas. And the fourth thing is the role of the king as Amir al-Mu'mineen, leader of the believers. Okay, the fourth one of these, the role of the king as Amir al-Mu'mineen, stays in Morocco. That one doesn't work anywhere outside Morocco. But the first 3 points, the Ash'ari Aqidah, the Mazahib, and the role of Sufi tariqas, become the internationally widely accepted definition of traditional moderate Islam. Once again, just like there was more to it on the Western side than one Rand report, there's more to it on the Muslim side than one royal speech. But just like that report really gives you the Western understanding on a plate, this speech gives you the Muslim world's understanding on a plate. One last thing to set up Sufism as moderate and traditional is that as the number of civil wars and general violence and atrocities and burning people alive in cages and awful things like that spread around the Muslim world, a lot of ordinary Muslims begin to sort of think, what is this? What is going on here? Is this Islam that is producing this? Can this be my religion that says that it's okay to burn people alive in cages? Do we need some other interpretation? And that's one reason why some people, some ordinary Muslims, not connected to policy institutes, not connected to kings or anything, why some ordinary Muslims start to look with slightly more interest than before at Sufism. And once again, the logic is my enemy's enemy. This is a so-called Sufi mosque in Libya, which the Salafis did not like and therefore blew up. This in some ways symbolizes the things that are going on the ground. Next, what is the current status of this? Okay, I'm going to run through a number of the major organizations which are out there in the world representing traditional moderate Islam. Sufism is traditional moderate Islam. And some of them are more successful than others. Probably the most successful one is in Morocco, where the king, the regime, the government decided to support especially one tariqa, the Bouchisheya of Sidi Hamza, who died recently. He's the sheikh of this tariqa. And the support, well, probably some financial support, certainly no restrictions, a lifting of restrictions, but also some nice jobs for some Bouchishis. And here we see Ahmed Tawfiq, who is a Moroccan Bouchishi, and he got the job of Minister of Religious Affairs. He has brought into the ministry some other Bouchishis. So, for example, the official within the ministry whose job was the continuing professional education of imams. So imams have to, once they've been trained, they've got a job, they have to come back every so often and take some refresher courses. And the guy in the ministry who was in charge of the refresher courses for all the imams was also a member of the Bouchisheya. So we have quite a tight alliance developing between the Bouchisheya and the Moroccan state, and the Bouchisheya is doing very nicely everywhere, and they actually are doing some very clever things to get members. One of them is something which was done also in Turkey by the Gulen movement, which was to get university students to provide free help for guys who are taking their high school exams as a way of bringing people into it. So the Bouchisheya has all sorts of very clever organizational modifications which mean that they do very nicely in the universities and amongst secular intellectuals and things like that. So this alliance is working super well, and one little indication for the Moroccan state of how well it was working is that during the Arab Spring there were some demonstrations and some counter-demonstrations, and the Bouchisheya was out on the streets demonstrating for the king. So, good deal. That's one of the very, very successful ones. Here's another successful one. This guy here, Habib Ali al-Jifri, is probably one of the most watched preachers today. I bet there's somebody in this room who's seen him. Has somebody in the room has seen him? Yes, I'm getting a couple of nods here. Okay. So he is he's of Yemeni origin. His family have been Sufi teachers for many centuries. They wound up in the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, and his father was actually at one point a politician in the People's Democratic Republic, so he was a communist leader. But he's going back to the family tradition, drawing on the family tradition, and he travels a lot. He talks on satellite television. He's on YouTube. I think, if I remember last time I looked, his most watched speech on YouTube had got 4 million views, which is quite considerable. So he is a resident of the United Arab Emirates and is evidently in certain ways being supported by the United Arab Emirates. He's also on quite good terms with the Egyptian regime. Another example, let us go to Jordan, and here we have the Royal Al-Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought, which is being run by a Jordanian Sufi who is actually also a member of the Jordanian royal family, and they're very active at the sort of international conference level, and they've produced various international declarations, a common word and statements about traditional Islam and so forth and so on. So that's my third example of how organized state cooperating Sufis in the Arab world are doing quite nicely, quite successfully promoting this idea of traditional and moderate Islam. And then in the United States, we have a number of popular preachers, and I bet somebody has also seen, can I get a nod? Yeah, okay, fine, yes. This guy, he doesn't get the same size of audience that Habib Ali al-Jifri does, but he still gets a pretty big audience, and especially in the US, on YouTube, internationally in the English-speaking world. So here are some good examples, some successful examples. It's not always as successful as that, and I should mention here just two little examples of where it isn't being very successful. One of them is in Egypt, where during after the revolution, when there were all these dozens and dozens and dozens of tiny little political parties getting organized who wanted to oppose the Salafis. You remember after the revolution we had, apparently we had the remains of the old regime on one hand, we had the Salafis on the other hand, and then we had people who described themselves as civil or secular, or civil sounded better, and there were all these civil parties around the place. Some of them, one of them here, the Voice of Freedom, I rather like, because they stole their logo from a 1970s British Telecom logo, which gives you an idea of how well organized they were, if they couldn't even get their own logo. Anyhow, all of these parties decided to team up with a Sufi tariqah to combat the Salafis. And the Sufi tariqahs, this was the period when everybody was demonstrating in Tahrir Square the whole time, and there were large groups of people coming to show how much support they had and so forth. And this was the point when one of the parties and their Sufi friends decided to get 1 million Sufis into Tahrir Square to show their support for this party against Salafism. And this is what happened. Not exactly 1 million people there. So that one was a complete farce. And the reason I'm trying to show you here is that although sometimes this combination of Sufism, traditional Islam, and the state works very, very nicely, sometimes it doesn't work at all. That's one of the most unsuccessful examples in the Arab world. In the United States, one of the most unsuccessful examples is this guy, Faisal Abdul Rauf, who was a very moderate, traditional Sufi preacher, getting a certain amount of support from various sources, indirectly, I think, from the US government. And one of his projects was to put together an interfaith centre. Can we get more moderate than an interfaith centre? Which is going to be called Cordoba House. Cordoba, you remember, where all the Muslims and Jews and Christians and everybody was happy together. So the plan to produce Cordoba House turns into the Ground Zero Mosque. And Faisal Abdul Rauf, instead of being the super moderate guy, ends up being the guy who is being attacked by all these demonstrations against the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. And what turned into the Ground Zero Mosque was actually meant to be an interfaith centre, not a mosque at all. So that one was a complete farce as well in the end. However, Faisal Abdul Rauf, despite the fact that this was not what was intended at all, Faisal Abdul Rauf probably did serve a useful purpose in de-radicalizing some Americans, some non-Muslim Americans, because he speaks very nicely and he makes Islam look really nice and so forth. So he probably reassured a few Americans. Okay, we also have the non-organized. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here of non-organized Sufis being sort of moderate and so forth. And my first example is a bestseller in Egypt, bestseller in the Arab Emirates, called the 40 Rules of Love. The word being used for love is which is the technical word in Sufism for being attracted to that place from which one's soul came, right? So here we've got this book about the 40 rules of Ishq, and everybody's reading it, and everybody thinks, oh my God, this is marvelous, I love Sufism, this is the diametric opposite of burning people in cages, this is the sort of Islam that I can relate to. The background to this book is quite interesting. It was written by a Turkish author, quite a successful Turkish author, quite a popular Turkish author, who has actually been living in London for rather a long time, and the book was in fact written first in English as the 40 Rules of Love. So it was translated from English into Arabic, it was also translated from English into Turkish, and it's a book which is really quite interesting. In the back of the original English edition, she thanks all the people who've helped her to understand Sufism, including, for example, Kabir Helminski. And Kabir Helminski doesn't perhaps sound a sort of entirely Turkish or Arab name. Kabir Helminski is, of course, an American convert, sheikh, very, well, I hate the term New Age, but, you know, some people describe them as New Age, and yeah. The fact that when you're reading this, you suddenly discover that Rumi has got an amazing, what do we call it, aura? Yes? And auras are not sort of standard parts of Islam, really. So this is New Age Sufism, really, and was doing really, really well. Another little example is just a slightly random group of guys in Cairo, led by Yogi Ali, who you see here, and they are combining yoga and Sufism. And here's Rumi, of course. Do you see the picture of Rumi there? They're combining yoga and Sufism, and they sometimes go on retreats. And boy, wouldn't you like to go on that Sufi yoga retreat? I mean, just look at that. Yes. So it's the non-organized Sufism is being quite successful as well. I mean, yeah, this is just half a dozen people, some of whom are actually related to their leader. But it's an example of the sort of thing that is going on. So that gets us to our conclusions. And the first question we have to ask is this Sufism truly traditional? Well, yes, in some ways it is truly traditional. Because, you know, Sufism has been around for an awful long time, and it has taken various forms. It's gone from the Khanqa to the Tariqa, and from the Tariqa to the five-star hotel Red Sea retreat. Why not? I mean, Sufism has been around for an awful long time, and it does change with places and periods, and it has changed with places and periods again. So yes, in that way, all this stuff is traditional. It's also traditional in the sense that Salafis are very definitely a modern, relatively recent, should I say, theological movement, and the Muslim Brothers are a recent organization, and Sufism is a lot more traditional than either of them. So in that sense, yes, this Sufism is definitely traditional. But in other ways it's not. And one of the ways in which it is not, one of the ways in which this is very modern, is if you look at the backgrounds of the people in question. The Butchishis, the leaders are all journalists and university professors. That's a fairly modern sort of person. Habib Ali al-Jifri, well, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen was quite a modern state. I mean, certainly wasn't terribly traditional. Who was my next guy? Prince Rezi. Prince Rezi met his Sufi sheikh while studying at Cambridge University. And the Sufi sheikh who he met whilst he was studying at Cambridge University had been reading an awful lot of French philosophy. So, yeah, once again, the background of these people. Hamza Yusuf, he's started off life as Mark Hansen. And there's some amazing stuff about his earlier life. These guys, they are very modern people, the leaders of all this. They have very interesting backgrounds. They have turned to tradition after rejecting modernity in various aspects of modernity. So that is why in one article I wrote recently I described these guys as neo-traditional. They're also not super traditional if you look at the way they operate. They are globalized, they are